Assalamu alaikum. Peace and serenity to all of you. This is Noha AlShugairi.
And this is Munira and you are listening to Family Connection, streaming live at One Legacy Radio. Today's topic for our show is raising teenagers, which is a very important topic, and many of our listeners have asked us, please do a show on raising teenagers. And with us, we have a very special guest, Dr. Donald Baumeister, who is a 61-year-old retired Orange County school social worker. For the past dozen years, he has taught undergraduate and graduate students at CSU Los Angeles. He has also taught at Chapman University, now known as Brandman, for more than 2 decades. And he has 2 master's degrees, one in social work and the other in public administration. He also has 2 doctoral degrees, one in law and the other in education. He has been married for 38 years with 2 grown children. The older daughter is a chemist and the younger daughter is a social worker. Wow. Dr. Baumeister earned a Vietnam Service Medal while serving as a Marine Corps officer with the 1st Battalion and 9th Marines. And he also was my former clinical supervisor and dear friend and colleague. Welcome to the show, Don.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm honored.
We're honored to have you. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, this topic of teenagers is, one of those, everybody's like, oh, teenage years, and parents wonder how are they going to handle it. So let's kind of start with developmentally, what is normal during the teenage years? Like, what can parents expect and what is normal?
Well, I think what's normal is what isn't normal. I hate to say it that way.
Like from the years before?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. It's different. Uh-huh. And the difference has to do with the two things I always talk about. Identity, who am I going to be, who am I going to turn into, and how do I get there? So the idea that I'm trying to separate from my parents in this process, and everybody's going to do that a little bit differently. Hopefully it's going to be a gentle process, but certainly it's not always a gentle process. And in that separation, because the idea of being a parent is to launch your children, at least, from a Western perspective, is to have the children then be successful adults. And in that part of being successful, what that means to different people. But certainly that whole idea of launching and helping them get to where they want to be is sort of what our goal as parents are. They never really leave, of course. That's the other myth. They never really leave, but at the same time, they're certainly going to have their own lives and their own professions and develop in that way.
You touched on a very good point right now, because within our Muslim community, there are many parents who actually believe that their responsibility is to make sure that their kids turn out in one specific way. So they don't see their job as just launching and preparing children to actually go out in the world and be successful adults. It's more like, no, they have to be in one specific way. And I feel that fuels a lot of the tension that goes within the Muslim community, but especially in the teen years between parents and teenagers.
Well, I think the idea is that, particularly here in the U.S., the idea is that we have a lot of options. One of the big things here is you came to America to have options, and not everybody can be a physician, not everybody can be a lawyer, not everyone can be an engineer, and the advantage of America is that you get to figure out what you want to do, right. And so certainly the support and all the help that the family can give is important to launch, but it's really, again, in our society here, the idea is, as individuals, you want to reach your highest maximum potential, and that may not be one of those other areas that other people wanted you to do.
Right. So could we talk about, like, in the efforts of teenagers to separate from their parents, what would be some of the common behaviors that are actually, even though they're abnormal for what was before, they're actually normal for that stage?
Well, I think there's a shift, and the shift comes from moving from the family and what the nest of the family can give to the peers and what that means. And so in that movement, oftentimes there can be tension. How long to stay out and who the friends are and all those kinds of things. But we go back to identity. The 3 questions that everybody has for identity is, who am I? Where am I going? How am I going to get there? And the who am I story is always about where I came from. So where I came from is sets sort of who I am. And you can't really separate those two. But where I'm going and how am I going to get there, that's what that's what the launching is about.
Okay.
You help them launch to those places. And again, the options that you have are broader in this community than maybe they've seen in the past.
Oh, you're absolutely right. I mean, teenagers have many, many more options than, well, even this is globally, actually. This is not even within the U.S. We're talking
course.
all over the world. But parents are still struggling with this separation and individuation.
Yes.
And it's a very difficult time.
And I think we want to think about it as a process, not as something that happens at a certain point. And again, we think about the parents. The parents are also, at some level, responsible for their parents. I mean, they're in that sandwich generation kind of thing, and so that never leaves either.
So could you talk about this? Because I don't know if all our listeners understand what the sandwich generation is.
The sandwich generation typically means that what we would call, and again, I don't mean to be too descriptive here in terms of the ages, but
Right.
roughly 35 to 50, 55, something in that range, where the parents have children and the children are in the process of developing, but the parents also have parents, and those parents are in that process of either retiring or sort of how are they negotiating older age. And the issue with getting older is always about the issue of loss.
Yeah, that's true.
What have I lost? I've either lost my community, I've lost my family, I've lost my health, I've lost my job, I've lost my whatever those things are. It usually surrounds loss. So they're in that sandwich. At one point, they're taking responsibility at some level for their own parents, and at the same time, they're trying to launch their children, and the tension with that sometimes can be very, very great. And so we'd like to see, if we can, the mother and father on the same page with that, so that they can each support each other, because it's not an easy process.
No.
Yeah,
And
there's a lot of things going on.
Absolutely. And imagine if we can get the teenagers on board, actually, to be a source of help rather than a source of tension too.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that goes back to what if we can think about it in terms of prevention and what that relationship is before you get to that point. Again, there's not a particular point in time where they I mean, there may be chronologically but in terms of what that means to them. About I'm a teenager today and I was a child yesterday. What that really means is that where did I come from? And so what was the relationship that I had with my parents? Now, that relationship is going to change. We know it's going to change. But can it change in a way that is a growth and a maturation rather than a complete separation? And that's what you want to try and do. You want to try and help them get to that point. But they're going to take that relationship with them. That they had, and so that's what I would think that how you want to present it in terms of that.
So how can parents then help their teenagers, navigate that when they're entering like middle schools, when the teenagers start, and high school? How can they help them do that?
Again, I think the big thing is what relationship did they have before they got there? So how did they talk with them? Did they have the time for them? And again, we know that. What I've seen in terms of working in the schools, one of the most difficult times was when there was losses. For example, the grandparents died or something like that, or one of the spouses died or something. And what really is always interesting to watch is that the parents, the person, the spouse that's surviving, doesn't have enough oftentimes, doesn't have enough emotional strength to handle their own issues and then handle the issues with the children. I mean, so the children are sort of left to sort of fend for themselves in that sense. So we have to be careful in making sure that we've got the support services either from the community or from the family to make sure that everybody's getting the help in terms of the loss, not just the obvious people. So the children have to get that additional support. Very, very important. And the idea is then, so when they come into this they're changing, their body's changing, their mind's changing, everything else is changing. They need oftentimes structure. Now, I don't mean to be rigid, not in structure in terms of rigid, but in structure in terms of these things are acceptable and these things aren't acceptable. But it's a variety of things that are positive, and so you take that that way of looking at things, and so and you take things as they come. One of the most important things to think about is trust. Do we trust our children? There's no reason not to trust our children until they do something that you can't trust them for. So don't assume that they are doing a lot of things terrible until you actually have some information in that way. So trust is very important. And the idea is that if you trust your children, most of the time, they're going to trust you back. You've invested in them, they've invested in you. There's no reason not to make that work. Maybe some tensions and all these other things, but trust is a big factor here.
Yeah, and this is where the differences in culture comes in again within the Muslim community, because for parents, they want the kids to behave in a specific way, and if they don't, then they don't trust them. And then they start enforcing specific rigid rules to prevent the children from behaving in those ways that are not acceptable to the parents.
And then it becomes a cycle.
It becomes a cycle. No, I mean, I think it's an issue specifically between the first generation and second generation. Like, I don't expect the same gap to happen, or the intensity of the gap, let's put it this way, between second and third.
I'm not aware of a specific research, but if I can go off track just a second and then come back if I go too far, let me know. But there's a concept called the 3-generation hypothesis. California here, it was developed in the Midwest, but in California, the culture that we use to describe this is the Japanese culture. Issei, Nisei, and Sansei. First, second, and third generation. And what happened in that particular culture, just as an example is that they were so interested in being acculturated that they basically, the first generation didn't teach the second generation about their background. And then when the third generation arrived, they said, gee, how come we look different than these other folks here? But we can't speak Japanese, we don't know the tea ceremony, we understand. And so they had to go back to the grandparents. And the whole idea was that they were set up in that way to move into the dominant culture. And then they found out that that wasn't really what they wanted. And so if we take that here, I think we have to show that there's the families have to be able to be comfortable in sort of a foot in both cultures. Again, easy to say, but every family is going to do that a little differently. But that transition in helping the child understand where they came from, that identity, but then also where they're going, right? And again, in a globalization kind of world, that could mean a lot of different things. But it's important to take that, what we learned from the Japanese, and be able to then translate that to other cultures.
So find a point in the middle. Not. I mean, basically, somewhat. I mean, it's easier said than done.
Easier said than done. Exactly.
We have in the chat box, M is saying, yes, I agree. Trust is important in all relationships. Rafiq says, I agree. And Musliman said, everyone needs to hear this show. So I'm glad you guys are listening and are appreciating it.
Thanks for inviting me.
So how do parenting practices change or evolve during the teenage years? I mean, do parents parent the same way when they parented a 6-year-old versus parenting a 16-year-old?
Of course not. Of course not.
Yeah.
And if you do, then
it's a disaster.
You're just asking for problems.
Yeah, right.
But the idea is to try to measure, again, easy for us to say, but try to measure allowing that child to be able to do more things as they are able to have the trust to be able to do more things. And again, that's a measure that every family is going to do differently. But the idea is that the more you trust you give, most of the time, the more trust you're going to be able to get back. And you basically give them enough rope, and I don't mean it in that the old saying, you give them enough rope to hang themselves. That's not what we're saying here. But give them enough freedom in the sense, and with freedom comes responsibility always. And so, and the responsibility to make sure that they're going to be able to engage not only where they came from, but where they're going, and trying to work on that bridge.
Whenever you're talking about a parent trusting the teenager, what's coming up for me is the parent's ability to trust the teenager's ability to actually critically think and then make good decisions. Yeah.
But historically, with that particular parent and that particular child, we would like to see that they've been able to make good decisions in small ways. Before, yes. Exactly. That's what we talked about from the prevention part. So they've made good decisions before, and you can talk to them about how they've made those decisions, and then how those decisions then are going to be made in the future. And so what are some of the things that are going to be difficult to make those decisions in the future? You're going to have more pressure, more temptations, and the consequences are more serious for making poor decisions.
Right. And I'm thinking also in terms of like there shouldn't be an expectation of the child is not going to make a mistake. They will make mistakes.
We all have made mistakes. We all have made mistakes. And the question is, have we the support system in place so that those mistakes aren't going to be critical in the sense of hurting us in some way or hurting somebody else, but are going to be critical in terms of our learning, because the more we can learn from our mistakes, probably the better off we're going to be.
I agree. I fully agree. Yeah.
So we have in the chat box Malay saying, I'm terrified of having a teenage daughter. And I think this paradigm of being terrified of having teenagers is very common with a lot of parents. Mm-hmm. So how can parents manage their teenagers from engaging in dangerous behaviors? Because I think that's usually where people are terrified. Their kids.
And that's where they start actually trying to control.
Right.
And then that backfires. I mean, but they have a hard time understanding that excessive control is not going to lead to good decisions and learning.
Well, again, I think if you've got a good relationship with your son or daughter, then that's going to, and you continue that good relationship, that's going to gauge what you're going to be able to do in terms of trust. Different families are going to, I remember we had a sleepover for our daughter when she was 14 in the 8th grade. And there was one particular family that didn't allow their daughter to spend the night, and that was fine with us. I made sure that they came over and she felt comfortable, and then I took her home to her family, and there wasn't any kind of judgment about that or anything like that. We understood that was part of the deal. And so I think those kinds of things, and making sure that it seems normal or comes across as being normal and not judgmental, that's very helpful. And I think everybody, and our children included, have a sense of what's the difference between right and wrong. And we help them nourish that understanding of what's right and wrong, and we help them get to the point where they're going to make better decisions. And we can talk with them about those decisions. Those decisions can be visceral in the sense of I really know, but I'm not really sure how to translate that.
Right.
And then they can be cerebral. Cerebral in the sense of, well, how did you make that decision? Help me, this maybe wasn't the best decision you made here, Don, but how did you make that decision? And sort of help them go through the process and help them understand how they could have made maybe a better decision. I always talk about it in terms of law and ethics, and the ethics part has to do with always don't be afraid to consult. Don't be afraid to go out and ask somebody else, gee, I don't really know everything about this particular area. Help me understand what I need to know about this particular area. So, and that means doing some reading. That means talking to folks in the community, but always making your own decisions for your family. Not worried about what the other community is going to say about that. It's important that the family makes that decision, and the family could be a larger family, meaning an extended family.
That's powerful.
Mm-hmm.
So you're listening to Family Connection, and today we are talking about raising teenagers with Dr. Don Baumeister. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to find out how the role parents should take when engaging and conversing with their teenagers.
Welcome back. You're listening to Family Connection, and today we're talking about raising teenagers with Dr. Dawn Baumeister. And we were talking before the break about generally what is to be expected in that phase. And then Dr. Dawn also was talking about what are some of the preventative measures to smooth the transition during the teenager years. And then we have a question in the box from Tina, and she's saying, is too much scolding bad for teenagers? What do you think?
Well, I would sort of reframe that a little bit. And we all know what happens to us when we feel we're being nagged. And you don't have to be a teenager or an adult. I mean, everybody understands what that means. And so what I would suggest, if we possibly could, is to try again to kind of go back to the big themes here. The big theme is, how can I help my child develop into a mature, responsible citizen and adult? And so how can I change what I'm doing differently to help that happen? And quote unquote nagging, using the N word here, nagging, probably isn't going to do that. So you have to think about, you have to sort of outsmart your children in that sense. You have to think about what are other ways to get done what I need to get done without continuing. Because what happens is that just sort of fosters a very passive-aggressive sort of relationship. And we know that passive-aggressive relationships aren't really that's really not a mature relationship. You're only getting a passive-aggressive relationship when you have a unequal power structure. And the idea here is we want to help that child be a better person. And how do I do that without the nagging in the process?
Do you have any specific idea about how they need to communicate? I mean, parents and teenagers, like.
Well, again, it's an evolution. It's certainly start as a parent. It's a sort of a one down kind of relationship, and the idea as they become teenagers in certain areas, you try to make it more of a egalitarian relationship. Not in every area, not in all areas, but that's how you sort of start. That's the process. And whether it's picking up your toys or cleaning up your room or getting your homework done before you can go out and play, those are all ways of structuring how to be a better parent without going through the nagging process.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay.
So, parents, they say teenagers never want to talk to them, or teenagers don't share anything, or
That's
so
true.
yeah. So
we
what
hear
is
that a
what
lot.
is the role parents then should take in engaging and conversing with their teenagers?
Well, I think there's a kind of a twofold. Certainly, I think some of that is normal. There's no doubt about that. There's this pullback from the family and sort of a more of an interest with the peers.
And you would tell parents it's okay? I mean, allow that with some limit?
Of course.
Don't fight it.
No, because I think if you fight it, what happens is that then you get that passive-aggressive, and then when I do have something I want to talk about, I know I can't, because all I'm going to do is get the pointy finger, and you should have done this, and you should have done that, and those kinds of things, and that's not going to be helpful. Mm-hmm. So again, I sort of see it as this progression, and not try to come up with a particular time frame, but the idea is that we move into that and giving them responsibilities in areas that aren't going to be critical if they make a mistake, and then helping them in more areas when they are going to make mistakes. So we're talking about, could be friends, could be, what am I going to do with my life? Could be, about driving. It could be talking about the texting things on the phone, how much of those kind of things happen, and being able to put some structure and some limits on those things.
So Tina is back in the chat box, and she has a question. As a mom, I try the empathy approach, but my husband believes in disciplining through scolding and nagging. How to overcome this clash in parenting style. So, we see this with many families where the husband's approaching it one way, the wife's approaching it one way. How can they, deal with that?
Again, and I don't mean to sound like a panacea that I have all the answers in that sense, but I think it goes back to, what do you want to get? Where do you want to get to? What do we want to have? We want to have children that are responsible, that are good citizens, that are doing a good job. And so really now we're not talking about what we want, we were talking about how to get there. And then when we talk about how to get there, then you have to focus on what's working. Okay. And we know that nagging isn't going to work.
Right, definitely.
So let's keep the eye on the eye as African American folks tell us keep the eyes on the prize.
Okay.
And the idea is that we know what we want. So now it's really about how to get there. And really we have, bright, intelligent parents. And it's really about how they are going to model for their children how to resolve a conflict. So the parents have a conflict. So they've got a certain way of doing things. And the children are going to be watching. I mean, their eyes are going to be 2 inches big on how the parents are going to be doing this. So the parents are going to be modeling for their children how they're going to solve this particular problem. And again, that problem can evolve. I mean, and that solution can evolve. It doesn't have to mean that once they've made a decision that all bets are off and that we have to do it that way all the time. So let's go ahead and think about how we can work together better so we can show our children how to work together better.
Right. Yeah, I've observed sometimes that, because sometimes I see in our community that, especially husbands, and I'm not trying to be judgmental here, but it happens so often, that husbands refuse input and influence from their wives. And so if that's the situation in your family and, you're trying to convince your husband of a different way of parenting, he's not listening to you, I think sometimes just him observing if you're succeeding with your child actually becomes an impetus for him to change. So never give up and don't give up your good practices just because your spouse is using something else. Go ahead.
And I'd like to say one thing here. It's going to sound like something small.
No.
But I always talk about never use the word change. Because as soon as you use the word change, what happens?
Resistance comes up.
The defenses come up, exactly.
Absolutely.
So another way of saying it is, how can we do this differently so that we can get a better result?
That's awesome. Mm-hmm. I'm so glad you said that. Did you hear that, Tina?
So now the other thing is that, again, I've been a clinician for more than 35 years, so that's kind of how I think about things. I've done other things, but what do we talk about here? We're talking about start where the client is, stay where the client is. Every strength is a weakness. Every weakness is a strength, depends on the circumstances. And that last one is important because oftentimes if we say the more traditional kind of family where mom stays home and the dad's working, the skills that the dad has at work are not necessarily going to be the same skills that are the best at home. So again, every strength is a weakness. Mm-hmm. Every weakness is a strength, depends on the circumstances. Mm-hmm. So we have to help people understand that, yes, this is a different circumstance, and what is working in this particular setting may not be what is going to be working in this other setting. And so you think of it that way, and then you think about it, how can we do it differently? Because as soon as you ask somebody to change, they're not going to do that. So.
Yes, lovely.
We have another question in the chat box from Stran. And he said, Doctor, first off, awesome name. He likes your name. Secondly, is there a better age for a father to have a teenager? And I guess what he means is in terms of connectivity and keeping a balance of being a father. How does he establish, I guess, a connective kind of relationship with his son?
Well, I guess I wouldn't be so presumptive as to say that there's one ideal way, one ideal time. Some people are fathers earlier, some people are fathers later. So I wouldn't put a particular time frame on that. I think what you want to think about is, what can I do both emotionally, physically, and spiritually to help make that connection with my son? If I can just say two things that my dad did.
Okay, no, we love personal stories, really.
Now,
okay.
One thing I didn't say in the opening part is that I'm adopted.
Oh.
So my parents couldn't have any children. I'll tell a very brief story about how they told me I was adopted.
And how old were you? Sorry, when you were?
I was 5 months when I was adopted. Okay. 5 months old. So my parents said, "Gee, Don, don't you want to know about that?" "Oh, no, I don't want to know." I said, "Well, Don, here's what happened. All these other people got stuck with their children, but we got to go down, and we looked over all of those children down there, and we saw that bright little face, and we got to choose you out of all those children that were available, and that's how we got you." So
what a loving way of telling you about this.
So that's how they told me. one of the things I always enjoyed so much with my dad, and even I would do it before he died, although he health-wise he didn't, but I always enjoyed going out fishing with my dad. You can't do anything wrong fishing. I mean, you'd like to catch some fish, but the idea was we were in this boat, he and I, middle of the lake, and you could ask your dad anything at that point because nobody else was listening.
Right.
And so he was not necessarily a well-educated man, but a well-read man. And
a wise man, it seems.
I'm biased, of course, but but he certainly was in my case. And one of the things that he really allowed me to do a lot of different things, and I respected that permission, so I didn't violate that trust. But I think if you can find an activity, I also did a lot of sports. I was on the Marine Corps track team, and I did other things in college and those kind of things. But there was always encouraged to be involved in sports, and they were always supportive of that. So between fishing and sports, and then I would always watch my dad with other men. Well, that's one of the important things about what fathers do, and fathers model for their children, particularly their sons, I guess, about what it means to be a man.
Yes, absolutely, and they
so,
need to see that.
And I was always impressed that other people would come over and ask my dad for his opinion on things. I always thought that was kind of interesting. They would make a point to come over, and he would be very judicious. He wouldn't say anything, and then he would sort of talk to them about, and he wasn't interested in therapy. He didn't particularly understand that part.
But it seems like intuitively he had it in him.
He was a very good man, what I can say.
Wow.
Well, everybody in the chat box is in awe of your story. Muslima said, wow. Bint Abi said tears. So everybody is moved by your story. Can you share with us stories of families who struggled with their teens and were able to overcome those challenges?
Yes, I think there certainly are children that are much more difficult than other children. I mean that's just sort of part of the deal, and the perspective. And if I can just sort of take a little bit from Father Greg Boyle, I heard him speak over the weekend again, and he's the executive director of Homeboy Industries, if you're familiar with what he does. And he always talks about that it's not that you can't love too much, but it's that part about love does as much more than does hate. And so I think the idea here is that you don't want to be stupid. You don't want to have your children come back and destroy the house and those kinds of things. I don't mean it in that sense. But I think you have to think about it in terms of what relationship do I want, and what kind of what am I willing to do to help make sure that this particular person I've given them every opportunity. There are some limits to that opportunity, but I've given them every opportunity, and will still talk with them, and keeping those lines of communication open, even when they've done terrible things. You're always going to be my child. You're always going to be, I'm always going to be your dad. And, we're sort of stuck with that.
I love this. I mean, this focus on unconditional love, regardless of what the children are doing. We're not talking about not setting limits here, but we're talking about...
or structuring those things in a way that you can help people.
Right.
That doesn't mean they get to do everything they want.
No,
I don't mean that sense. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that the idea is that people are going to make mistakes. We've all made mistakes. And what we try to do is minimize those mistakes, and we try to not make the same mistakes again and again and again. That's really what we're talking about to help our children.
But this totally goes against, people who say, oh, if my kids do X, Y, and Z, I'm going to kick them out of the house, or I will never talk to them again, or all these ultimatums. It's to kind of shift that thinking of your unconditional love for that child, even if they make mistakes, with setting limits, is so much more powerful than, giving them ultimatums and pushing them away, ultimately.
I think in the long run, I mean, you may get to those points. I understand that, and this isn't meant to be judgmental in any way. But the idea is that you certainly have to start on that end, and if we're going to make mistakes, we're going to make mistakes more on that side than on the other side. Once the child has made his or her own decisions, then there may be some other things that happen after that. But the idea is that certainly at the beginning here, you gotta give them the benefit of the doubt.
Any stories you want to share about parents or families who struggled and overcame the struggle?
Well, I think the families that I've seen keep the lines of communication open, families that have a lot of resources, and I don't mean financial resources, but I mean emotional resources, and folks that tend to be more flexible, and you know, we want to talk about it in terms of structure, but not rigidity. People that tend to be more flexible, and I think the word acceptance comes up. Not all of our children, what if we have a child that's in special ed?
Yeah, I know.
And you know, what's the goal here? The goal here is to help that child maximize his or her potential. As a parent, that's what I want to do. And maybe that child's not going to be able to take over my part of the business, or that child isn't going to do these other things. But what do we want? We really want that child to be the best person that child can be. And so that acceptance in terms of people are going to be doing the best job that they can. May not be the job that we want, but they're doing the best job that they can.
Yeah, I think that shift in perception is so huge. And if parents actually are able to see it through the lens you're sharing with us, it actually eases a lot of the tensions.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah.
And acceptance is so important. We know that just intrinsically. We know that.
So you're listening to Family Connection, and today we're talking about raising teenagers. And with us, we have special guest Don Baumeister. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about families who can go through these challenges of the teenage years, and what characterizes families that are able to kind of go through the challenge in a positive way.
Welcome back. You're listening to Family Connection, and today we're talking about raising teenagers with Dr. Don Baumeister. And before the break, we talked about so many things. And right now, we're going to move into what are the characteristics of families who were able to actually overcome struggles during the teen years.
Well, in my classes, I usually give out this handout. It's got 15 items, and I'll go ahead and read those quickly. And it's titled Characteristics of Healthy Families. The healthy family communicates and listens, affirms and supports, teaches respect for others, develops a sense of trust, has a sense of play and humor, shares responsibility, teaches right from wrong, has a strong sense of kinship with many traditions, has a balance of interaction, shares a spiritual core, respects the privacy of one another, values service to others, fosters family table time and conversation, shares leisure time, and acknowledges problems and seeks help.
Very comprehensive list,
yeah,
right?
I mean, it covers all aspects of a family's life, and many of those things we've talked week after week on this show about. How families can be stronger.
Some of them have to do with the connection, like making sure we carve out time to actually connect with one another, like the conversation at the table.
By that meaning, an emotional connection.
Yeah.
One of the things that you asked me the question earlier about stories of families. I remember one family telling me how they were able to keep the children to be able to speak Spanish as well as English, and how they did that. Because some Spanish speakers, because wasn't much support at the schools to do that, they really said, okay, we're not going to teach you Spanish because we don't have an accent and all those kinds of things. So this particular family, I thought, did a great job. And this was their plan. They said that regardless of what's going on, we're going to speak Spanish at dinner. Everybody eats dinner together, and if we've got people over, that's fine, doesn't matter. We're speaking Spanish only at dinner.
Wow.
And so everybody, if you wanted to pass the peas or the tamales or whatever it was, you'd better be able to say that in Spanish. You better talk about what happened in your day in Spanish. And so that I thought that was a great way of any other time is okay. You can talk in English, or we'll do that. But at dinner time, we're talking in Spanish. Exactly.
And they followed through with that.
Yeah, and everybody
succeeded.
Yeah. I thought that was a great way of doing that.
Absolutely.
To think about that.
I mean, yeah. I mean, I can't say that I failed at doing that. My husband tried. Honestly, my husband, he suggested the same thing, like speak Arabic at dinner. Only Arabic.
Yes.
But,
didn't happen.
I mean, it didn't happen. And I am also to be blamed for that myself, not only my children.
For bringing that up.
No. I mean, it's just like...
but there are families who are able to do that.
Yeah,
I've heard of
exactly.
other families
exactly.
that are able to do that. And I think it brings that kinship, and it brings that connection and family tradition that's being created that, that it's their little thing that they do, and it actually helps them, improve themselves and learning a new language, but also they feel connected to the rest of their family members.
Of course. I think it's a great way of doing that.
I admire families who do that, really honestly. So if you're doing something like that, continue.
Yeah. So let's talk about, life has become very complicated from when we were teenagers, right? and now
Much
raising
more.
teenagers. So let's kind of talk about advice for parents in regards to technology, with Facebook and Twitter and texting and the internet. What do parents need to be aware of?
Well, again, my family calls me the grumpy grandpa. So I'm not as tech savvy when it comes to these sorts of things. But if I had children in that age range, I would definitely have to be a little more tech savvy with that. I've promised not to use Facebook and so, but that's almost like a political kind of decision for me.
In your family? or no, okay, I see.
But anyway, but the idea is that the parents, you want to balance, but these sort of things, when they go bad, they can really go bad, in a terrible, terrible way. So we've all heard of stalkers who find children online and meet up with them and those kinds of things. So I think the parents have to just as we talked about healthy families, there's a sense of privacy. I think you have to have a sense of privacy. But at the same time, you don't want to sacrifice the privacy for understanding not only the technology, but what is going on. So I think you have to be comfortable. Again, it's this, if you're getting feedback that things aren't working in the house, right? Things aren't working well in the family, then you may have to take a little more drastic, if you want to use that word, means to find out what's actually going on. But that's not where you start. You don't start there. You start in a more progressive kind of way, sharing what kind of limitations are we going to put either on the gaming or on the texting, and are you going to take these things to school, and what does that mean, and who are your friends? And I mean, it's just an extension of all of that, and it has to go back to that relationship again, that this is part of their sort of pressing the limits and looking at independence, but you have to be able to set some structure in that.
I really love this point that you've made it more than once in this show, and I really am hoping that our parents are listening to this, which is basically, I'm going to emphasize it because it's so important. Do not set limits based on what you're afraid of. Set limits based on trusting your children, and if something goes wrong, then you need to reassess and then put other structure in place. Because actually, a lot of our parents base structure based on fears. They tell me, Noha, no, they can't, for example, be on Facebook, just as an example, because so many bad things happen on Facebook. And I go but you could teach them.
Exactly.
You could teach them, how to use it, because once they leave your home, I mean, they need to know how to use it as a...
Yeah, it's definitely a tool of the 21st century. There's no doubt about that. And we know what's happened in the Arab Spring with all Facebook and those kinds of things. But the idea is, from a parent-child standpoint, is that they don't have to have all of that information at once.
Meaning, you mean like the children?
The children. I mean, it's a process. And so I think you have to think about it in that process way. How do we do that? Now, it may happen more fast, more quickly than what they'd like. That part I understand. But still, you don't have to make all those decisions immediately.
No, and not at one point. But
Right.
sometimes I feel parents get surprised because the children go to school, they're
Of course.
exposed to their friends who are using all of this. They come home,
Sure.
and the pressure is up.
Sure, but again, that's part of what it means to be a parent, trying to stay ahead of that particular curve.
Yes.
Right? You got to be reading about that. You got to be talking about that. You got to be understanding that, and that's part of the parents' responsibility. That's not the children's responsibility to teach the parents about that.
Yeah, I mean, I knew a dear friend who got on Facebook, years before her children entered middle school. And she said, I'm not going on Facebook for myself. I want to be on it so that I know in a few years my kids will be, going on Facebook. And I'm aware of this new technology because technology is moving so fast. And if we kind of say, oh, no, I'm not going to do this, I'm not going to text, I'm not going to be involved, you're losing a potential way of connecting with your kids too and being in the know. So it is important to kind of know before you enter these certain stages of what's coming up and how you're going to manage it.
Ignorance has its own risks.
Yeah,
right?
that's so true.
And so we want to, we want to guard against the ignorance. That doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And, the other thing I want to ask you is sometimes parents feel like, maybe they hit middle school years and they get the phone and they get the Facebook and they started with nothing in, the earlier years. And then all of a sudden they get everything, what are your thoughts on that? Like, I would think it would be a process,
you've heard me.
Yeah.
It's a process.
Yeah.
They don't have to get everything at once. Right. And I think you can slow that process down without being too rigid about it, but slow that process down. You're not going to have your 12-year-old, think about dating an 18-year-old. I mean, can they do other things with peers? And in terms of how are you going to help them do that? And so I think you just have to think of it in that way because you can't vote till you're 18. You can't.
Right.
Buy alcohol till you're 21. I mean, we see that in our communities that we do that anyway. So, but setting hard and fast, times and dates, I think is probably not the best way. I used to tease my daughters about that. That they couldn't date till they were about 24 or something like that.
Whoa.
Used to tease them about that, but they knew I was joking.
Right. And the other piece of it is if the family, for example, you as a family need to establish your own value system. So you don't need to yield to the pressures of like, okay, the neighbors are doing this and, our best friends are doing this. You need to have your own value. You need to be clear with your children and you need to give them space so they can actually feel part of the community.
You don't have to go. I would say that the way I would say it is, you don't have to go to the lowest common denominator.
Okay.
You don't have to rush to the bottom.
Okay,
You
that's
don't
good.
have to do that, right? You get. I think your family is going to decide what's going to be best for your family, but you base that decision based on knowledge and understanding, not based on fear and I'm trying to and over controlling.
Right. Yeah.
So we only have less than 10 minutes left in the show, but I want to talk about friends. I think in the teenage years, parents, when your kids are younger, you set up play dates, you really know who your kids' friends are, you're really involved. And as they become older, they kind of develop their own friendships and have their own relationships. How can parents, engage in all of that in a way that's healthy?
Well, I think one of the things that you would try to do is try to understand and meet the parents of the children that your children are playing with. Now, it's easy on the block, of course.
Yeah.
But when you're at school, it makes it a little more difficult. But I think that's an important piece. You want to know who those folks are, and that will help guide which friends you would encourage them to be with and which friends you may not encourage them to be with. Mm-hmm. So I think getting to know the parents is part of the deal. And just because they go to the same school, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're the best. Right. The best that you have to go along with whatever they bring home. So I think that's important. And the other part is just, think about sports, think about, academic decathlon kinds of things. And you'll get to see those parents at those situations, whether it's cheerleading or whatever else is going on. What are those those outside groups, and you get to meet the parents under those circumstances also.
So like get the kids involved in activities that are productive and useful, and then hopefully their friend cohort would be also somebody that's focused and seeking to be successful and productive.
And meet the parents in that process.
Definitely, yeah. Even though we have in our community kids who actually don't want their parents to meet the other parents, they're embarrassed. Some of them are embarrassed of their parents meeting others' parents. Some of them are, they're worried about the reaction of their parents. I mean, there are so many factors going there.
Well, and again, I think if we can go back to what we talked about in terms of trust and responsibility and what's the big picture here, the big picture is they're going to be in a heterogeneous world, right? I mean, that's what the globalization is just a fancy word for everybody's in the same pot here. Right. So that doesn't mean you have to agree with everything, but you certainly have to figure out ways to interact with folks that are different than you are. Absolutely. And different in a lot of different ways. Right. So, and there's no magic to sports. I don't mean that's the end all and be all.
No.
But you find something that you feel comfortable with, and whether it's the chess club or whether it's
computer club,
the computer club or whatever that is, then that you can help your child be more focused in something that that you're interested in, and they're interested in too, and you guys can share that. I mean, just one of the interesting things about this particular community is traveling, because we know how there's a lot of families in a lot of different places, and traveling is just a way to open up and meet other things and see other people and see different communities.
We have a question in the chat box from Tina. She said, "Is too many compliments bad for teenagers?"
Well, I think you have to. Again, I would always sort of think about it from a mediation kind of point. The idea of compliments is that you help somebody realize that they're doing a good job or they're attractive or whatever the compliment is about. But we don't want to be unrealistic about it, because what happens sometimes with quote unquote too many compliments is that they go to other new environments. They go to college, and if their teachers aren't giving them the same compliments that mom's giving them or dad's giving them, then they somehow are going to be not in reality. I mean, the reality is that you don't get a compliment for everything you do in the community.
That's true.
Right? And so I think you have to, what we want is a reality kind of check, and just to make sure that they understand that compliments are earned, not just given.
Right. And I think she's coming from the position of like there are too many compliments being given nowadays for children. They're so focused. They think that this is how we build self-esteem.
Well, remember the issue with self-esteem. The issue with self-esteem always is how do you feel about yourself? But the complementary part of self-esteem is how you treat other people. So if I feel great about myself, but I treat other people poorly, who cares? I mean, it doesn't matter how I feel about myself. So you really always have to think of those two aspects of it. The first aspect is, who am I? Where am I going? How am I going to get there? All that identity kinds of things. But the real issue in self-esteem is how am I going to treat other people? And that's respect for others and respect for what they do. So I think you have to be careful about making sure if you just compliment people just to be complimenting them, they may feel great, but they treat other people poorly. That's not a good plan.
Yeah, definitely.
So any final thoughts you want to share with our listeners?
Well, just thank you so much for giving me this opportunity, and hopefully I haven't made too many cultural faux pas.
No.
And just wish you guys the best and continue with this. I'm very happy that you have this opportunity and that you asked me to us with that. So thank you so much.
We were very honored to have you.
Thank you so much.
And I think maybe Munira will post the characteristics of the healthy family on Family Connection on
our Facebook page. Yeah. So those of you who have been listening, we have a Facebook page, Family Connection. Come on it, like it, and we will post up all these characteristics that Dawn talked about today. So thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Very informative.
I appreciate it.
And we've had all these comments. Tina said, thank you so much. May God bless you. Strand said, amazing show. Muslima said, wow, thank you. Great show. And we're going to end the show today with our quote of the day. And this one is by Bruce Lee. Live content with small means, seek elegance rather than luxury, and refinement rather than fashion. Be worthy, not respectable, wealthy, not rich. Study hard, think quietly, talk gently, act frankly, bear all cheerfully, do all bravely, await occasions, hurry never. And in a word, let the spiritual, unbidden, and unconscious grow up through the common.
And we will post this as well on Family Connection on the Facebook page. And you needed to talk about the podcast,
yes,
right?
Our podcasts are up. If you want to purchase any of our previous shows and podcasts, go to our website. Shows are $1.99, or you can subscribe for the year, and subscriptions are $9.95, and you can catch all of our previous shows. So go on onelegacyradio.com and take a look at those.
Yeah. And next week, we are going to be talking about the Google generation,
Yes.
you and I, and two special guests, I think, most probably. Yeah. So tune in next Tuesday, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair for tuning in. This is Noha AlShugairi.
And this is Munira Zadeen.
And remember, a strong family for a strong community. Be there, connect, encourage, and love. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.